this was going to go and should have been in the news really, but the SNAP benefits, formerly known as food stamps, which is a program for low-income people in America, and supplied roughly 40 million Americans in 2018. Staggering number. And approximately 9.2% of American households obtained SNAP benefits at some point during 2017 also, with approximately 16.7% of all children living in households with SNAP benefits. Now, the reason I put it in is some of your state politicians are trying to axe the whole program. Take note. Another little caveat. Did you know Canadian doctors were being paid $300 for sterilising Indian women back in 1954? $300 in 1954 to sterilise Indian women. As per usual, Vancouver and British Columbia was the key portion of it. So that region's skullduggery goes back way further than many think, and was all part of the Dr. Green, is that colour-coded again, Mengele experiments and land grabs of the natives for minerals. The main body piece of the op-ed is about the anniversary yesterday, 18 years ago. And I will warn, the first paragraph contains sarcasm. Please don't take it literally. You'll see why I said it shortly. But it was the anniversary of one of America's darkest moments, as nearly 3,000 lives were lost on that day, and over 1,000 more since due to the effects directly impacted from that day. It will go down as one of the most magical days ever, where magical things took place and people did the most extraordinary magical things known to man, as you will hear in this piece. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world with connections to the dead or the dying, that day will live long in the memory. Even myself, living in the UK at the time, I had a niece who lived and worked in New York and also close to the World Trade Center also. I think it was Building 3. Now, thankfully, she was spared, and typical of her, she instantly responded to a plea for blood as hospitals were running low. And she stood for hours waiting to give blood to people who were complete strangers, only to arrive at the desk, and when she gave her details and said she was a British national, she was told, "We won't take blood from people in the UK." Another example of what happens to people who try to help others, and a further example of the idiotic bureaucracy as far back as then, only it's 10 times worse now. Oh boy, it's 10 times worse. Either a recent dental appointment, and some of the questions I was asked was what genitals I was born with. Seriously. How many times I have sex each week, is it alone or with partners? For a freaking dental appointment. And people answer those questions. Not me. I was tempted to ask the dental specialist the same questions before being examined. But my UK ironic humour sometimes gets lost over here. But it's gone way beyond levels of madness. But millions more that day were affected. That essentially sent 300 million Americans into a state of shock bewilderment, and in many cases a state of partial or complete amnesia. Now, much has been said and written about that day. Many so-called conspiracies proven to be more true than the official story, and certainly the treasonous commission tasked with not revealing the full details of that day, but to obfuscate it in a storyline one can only describe as a conspiracy. It bordered on disbelief to any critical thinker, but to the amnesic masses it was a form of closure so they can carry on with their lives thinking the world is all hunky-dory. Life to them is all about the next beer, joint, baseball or football game or the next shopping trip, with the delusional thinking process of it doesn't matter because it didn't happen to or affect me. It affected us all. It set in motion wars totaling $1.6 trillion and the cost of lives of over 5,000 American soldiers and tens of thousands injured, and it still rolls on to this day. We've lost freedoms and rights in the mysteriously compiled, almost overnight, they say, Patriot Act bill. Thousands of pages long, no one read it, and all voted for it. The reality was that bill was compiled before the event, which again was suggesting prior knowledge by some. Now, people can argue whether it was a plane, a UFO, a missile, or whatever hit the towers. That is the distraction. It is what unfolded after that defies basic logic, all known physics and common sense. And like many tragic souls that day, it went completely out of the window. How can two buildings which were designed to withstand being hit by planes? But let's ignore that fact. The official story that jet fuel burnt the buildings and they collapsed. Let's ignore jet fuel cannot melt steel at those temperatures required, shall we? But the fact that fires were only on 4 to 10 floors maximum in both buildings. And yet it managed within an hour to melt every steel beam from floor 1 up to floor 76. Magic stuff, that, is it not? But let's ignore that too. The fire melted floors around level 76, as stated, meant that should it have melted in the official way, the floors 74 and above would have toppled over and left the 70 plus floors in place. Not according to the Commission report, conspiracy theorists. They went to elaborate attempts to prove how it happened, and what's worse, the people bought into it. Sadly, that has, or gladly, I should say, that has decreased in the last decade, more so of the last 5. The gist is with the melting theory, is the building would have collapsed over many hours and many days, and would have collapsed in a concertina fashion, not a 9-second free fall. To have a 9-second free fall requires the building collapsing and has no resistance. Otherwise it would pancake down, which means to every rational person, even without a construction, physics or engineering certificate, is those buildings were brought down with some sort of explosives. So no resistance on the free fall was met. Now, the average time to set up and carry out A designated and controlled demolition of a building that size takes 7 to 9 months to prepare for. That means many knew well ahead of time when those buildings were going to be destroyed. Who took part in planting the explosives, which the Commission denied despite video evidence to the contrary? What his story doesn't tell you is a B-25 bomber crash in 1945, an aircraft accident in which a B-25 Mitchell bomber crashed into the Empire State Building. And yet, the accident did not compromise the building's structural integrity. Funny that. What is not funny is that it did cause 14 deaths and an estimated damage of $1 million. Strange that, isn't it? Then we get into some of the characters involved in this crime. People connected to Enron. All the investigation papers surrounding Enron all went up in flames and never heard about again. Rumsfeld, who had just announced trillions of dollars are missing or unaccounted for out of the DOD a day earlier. Cheney. If you watch the film about him, Vice will tell you all you need to know about him and his role that day. Bush family, not just Junior, who was carefully placed as far away as possible in a classroom in Sarasota, Florida, who famously slipped up before even going into the classroom by saying to the media, quote, he had just watched a plane hit the tower. That footage of the first plane hitting the tower by a seemingly unknown French photographer, but that photographer is more connected than most people realise, was not released until 2 or 3 days later. Oops. That faux pas is likely why they kept Bush away from the media for the rest of the day and sent him and Air Force One on a zigzag across America all day. The fact that he was in a classroom reading the book The Pet Goat upside down should not be overlooked. Or some of the words being shouted out by the children in that class either. Planes and hit were just 2 of them. The children were asked to repeat by the teacher whilst soft-shite Bush sat there with the Pet Goat book upside down. Seemingly oblivious. The real president that day was the Black Dragon leader, Dick Cheney. Go and watch the movie Vice. Others complicit in that day was Larry Silverstein, who bought those buildings 5 to 6 months prior to the event at the last minute, after Jared Kushner, yes, him again, and his group was about to purchase them. Silverstein then proceeded to put some bizarre double insurance on both buildings, which in the event of an incident would double his payout. And yet the insurance company never questioned that before or after the event. You've all dealt with insurance companies, you know how they'll do anything to get out of paying. Silverstein, like Kushner, knew they were buying those buildings, that both of them were in need of demolition due to the vast volumes of asbestos in those buildings when they were built. They both knew. There was many people who were reporting sickness when working in those buildings. So Silverstein purchased those buildings for $1 billion. Jeb Bush's company provided the security for those buildings, and yet just months later he received a $12 billion payout after they were conveniently demolished. 18 years on, and still no investigations into Silverstein and his ilk. The mayor that day, Giuliani, also made a faux pas, stating that the Building 7 had to be pulled as it was collapsing, he stated. Within 2 hours, a burning building, it appears. The demolition team that normally takes around 4 to 5 months to set up a demolition for a building that size, yet amazingly managed to complete that task in under 2 hours. We all saw the building collapse in on itself in a controlled demolition. And yet, no planes hit that building. Yet again, amazing, magical stuff. Also, what was amazing is the same mysterious demolition company that did 4 to 5 months' work in under 2 hours that day also managed to empty out several floors of equipment, as stated by a janitor in that building when inspecting it for evacuation. Whole floors were empty except the carpets. Who authorised and carried out that task? Then we had another spooky, magical event where the BBC managed to state live on air Building 7 had collapsed 26 minutes before it happened. The BBC reporter was reporting live in a New York studio, and the Building 7 behind the broadcaster was still standing. Amazing broadcast that. And I wonder, do they do the lottery at the BBC? Then we had the curious story of a newly renovated wing of the Pentagon, the region of the real white hats. All that followed were largely fake. The most secure building in America, we are told, with thousands of agents, cameras and surveillance all around the building, the most advanced security in the world, and yet they could only produce one 4-second, very grainy video months later from a security gate camera. But let's ignore that, shall we? Or the fact that agents went into all the hotels around the Pentagon, gas stations and other buildings, taking all the surveillance cameras and the footage away, and yet amazingly never released any of it to the public. The Pentagon, of course, had another miracle or magical event that defied logic and physics, of how a plane went through not one wall, but 6 of the most reinforced walls that are 10 feet thick each, and yet still left a round hole in a wall, stating it was the nose cone of the plane. Funny that, isn't it? It appears the nose cone of that plane had magical qualities, does it not? Because when a few birds hit the nose of a plane, it puts large dents or tears in it. And yet this plane went through 6 10-foot thick reinforced walls and survived to reach the final wall. Then we had the curious miracle event of the same alleged plane that crashed into the Pentagon, containing a known TV star who was married to Theodore Olson, who successfully represented presidential candidate George W. Bush in the Supreme Court case of Bush versus Gore, and subsequently went on and served as the US Solicitor General in the Bush administration. Oh, how the dots connect. Barbara Olson, who attended the University of St. Thomas, whose Ireland has recently come under investigation along with the Epstein issues, also attended Yeshiva University, and so Jewish links. But Barbara, like the BBC and others in this story, also managed to do miracle acts by phoning from her mobile phone on a plane, when mobile phones never worked on planes back in 2001. Nearly a decade later. And rang her husband on a phone that can't work to tell him the same story the media were about to put out, that despite the most sophisticated surveillance system and spy mechanism in the world, a few people with box cutters managed to take over 4 planes simultaneously. Obviously, those hijackers had the same magical powers that many others had that day. But Olson also had Barbara connection to the Clintons. She was part of investigations into the Clinton administration in 1994. She became chief investigative counsel for the US House of Representatives Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. I wish they'd shorten these titles. In that position, she led the Travelgate and Filegate investigations into the Clinton administration. Was she another victim of the Clinton family death trial? Question mark. Then we had the fact that with the president out of the way, both Cheney and Rumsfeld told the American military to stand down. Well, the ones on the ground anyway. Because by another magical coincidence, and I said that deliberately, most of America's Air Force at the time was carrying out a training mission to hone their skills. The mission that day was to train in the event of a plane hitting the Twin Towers. And they were testing their responsibilities. No military plane got off the ground in or around New York, despite several bases within the reaches of the towers and the Pentagon. And then we come back to Mr. Rumsfeld and the Shanksville plane. A plane that also did something magical by crashing into the ground and yet leaving little to no remnants of it. Which suggests it was blown up in the sky to rational thinkers. And then Rumsfeld slipped up and said it was shot down on national TV, which is still curiously overlooked by many. What was also overlooked is that plane had magic qualities again also, as people were able to use their cell phones on that plane as well. And it set the stage for the American hero story, all scripted in full-blown Hollywood fashion, was created of how the passengers took on the terrorists and brought the plane down themselves to prevent more tragedy on the country. A very noble story, but given what Rumsfeld said, highly unlikely. I will leave the Shanksville story with a quote from the coroner at that time, which he's tried to since rescind. Wallace Miller, the coroner of Somerset County, Pennsylvania, quote, "I stopped being the coroner after about 20 minutes because there were no bodies there." Unquote. Another magical event took place in the Twin Towers. There was a high volume of Jewish workers in those buildings, and yet no Jewish people came to work that day. Except one guy around 7:30, which is about an hour and a quarter before the first plane hit Ballpark, where he was told to get out by a Jewish-based service system. How and why did that server know? Again, now we have magical servers like the BBC predicting events. No Jewish people who worked in those buildings died in that event. Why did so many of them take that day off when it's not a Jewish holiday? These are the questions that 18 years on still needs to be answered. So not only can the American people be informed in the proper way and a chance to process and heal, but also provide closure to the many families who lost loved ones and have suffered horribly since that day. The real truth of 9/11 will be both shocking and cause outrage globally. The official story makes little to no sense, and at this point is rendered a conspiracy theory. But much of what has been written about that day that was perpetrated throughout the alt media to make the real unanswered questions fade into the background, as more and more outlandish theories were deliberately spread throughout the alt media to render the subject down to levels of comedic, and subsequently for the masses to reject it. We're going to play a song now in memory of those who died that day and since, and also a remembrance for one of our members who died a year ago last week, Luna Lisa Doherty.